Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon Muñiz.
All right. So there's this guy named Freud, apparently. I don't know if anybody here has heard of him.
No.
Turns out he's supposedly a big deal.
Really?
I feel like Freud is the deal. Freud is the person. Whenever anybody thinks about psychology, it's all about Freud. And so, like, we've been talking about stages of development in the previous podcast with Piaget and Erikson, and we have to talk about Freud because Freud is the foundation of an entire field of psychology. Like, there are people whose entire careers are built about just like, I want to understand a little bit more about Freud. So I feel like if you haven't figured it out yet, today's episode is the Freud special.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really fun. I totally agree with you, Phil. Whenever someone says psychology just out and about in real life, because, our world is no longer real. But, but like, everybody thinks of Freud. Everybody knows Freud. And they're just, people will be like, oh, that's a Freudian slip. And people don't actually know what they're saying when they say a Freudian slip. Right. Yeah. So I think it's worth, like you and I had talked about taking a moment, and I can't believe we hadn't covered the actual stages of psychosexual development before. I'm still baffled about that because we talked so much about different, thinkers, and we talked about different theorists when this podcast was first born. But Freud is interesting. So Freud is outdated. Let's start with that.
Yeah. Okay.
And always, the views that we express that are shared here are Freud's views, not necessarily our own. There is some element, right, of rationality to them or rationale, but just kind of take what we say with a grain of salt. So Freud, kind of thinking back, had 5 major stages of psychosexual development. And Freud was really, really interested in, what kind of went beyond the surface and the motives people might have had for doing different things. And part of this centered around, okay, what gives people pleasure at different points in their life, and what problems can come up if that isn't met, right? Or if they stay in one in one, not mindset, but in one preference, age for too long. So I think the first one is probably the most intuitive one, and this is why I said, some of this fairly rational, and that would be the first stage, which is the oral stage. So that's the first year of life. You think about it, what is a 1-year-old, right? A 6-month-old, we were actually just having a conversation about my nephew. What are they doing? They are putting things in their mouth, right? They are putting their fingers in their mouth. They are eating, they're playing with their food, which is part of, the process. They're tasting things. And so it's this I don't want to use that word yet. But they have this focus, this emphasis on what goes in their mouth, what's oral, and that's where they're deriving pleasure from. Yeah. But let's say that something goes wrong and they're kind of stuck in this, mental age. Someone can, according to Freud, develop an oral fixation. That's why I had to stop myself earlier. And those are things that, people are constantly doing with their mouth. So smoking would be one of them. People who are constant, and actually, I just realized this as I was about to say it. People who put their chains in their mouth.
Yeah.
Have you ever done that?
Nope. I'm not a big chain person, but I definitely bite my fingernails, which Freud would say is an oral fixation.
Yeah, I was just realizing, because sometimes I just put my chain on my mouth, or just move it back and forth. And I know people who just pull up, put a chain in their mouth. And so some element of oral fixation right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think of little kids and when they first get to try food, and I feel like that's a perfect example of Freud's oral stage.
Yeah, that is all they care about, right? According to Freud, this is where their joy comes from. Feeding is pretty much it, and then putting stuff in their mouth. I do want to take kind of a moment, though. Freud, there is some stuff that is super dated and not really kind of getting behind it. But the whole field of psychoanalysts is Freud created this. And so the whole idea here is that there is stuff going on below the surface that you're not even aware of, and you need someone's help to analyze your psyche. And so Freud cares a lot about stuff that happened early in your life And so if somebody is like 40 and they're a smoker and they say, I can't quit smoking, Freud's going to be like, oh, that's because of what happened when you were 6 months old.
Yeah.
Right. And so this, that might seem strange, but I feel like more and more, at least in my life, I'm starting to understand that like some of the stuff that happened to me when I was younger has shaped the way that I view and see the world. And like, honestly, it's something even at the age of like 35, I'm like, okay, like these things, I'm like still learning like, oh my gosh, that's why I'm this way.
Yeah.
And so at first I used to be like this whole psychoanalyst field, like I hate, but I'm like, the more I start to understand myself, the more I'm like, oh, okay, like there are things that are affecting me that I sometimes am not even aware of. Like, why was I angry? Why did I respond in such a way in this scenario? And it's like, oh, because of this, or it reminded me of this scenario. So yeah, like it's all about these subconscious things and like the stages of development. A lot of stuff that Freud thinks kind of is affecting people later in their life has to do with what happened earlier. So like smoking and things like that, like chewing your nails, also like some eating disorders, right? According to Freud, like these are purely tied to like something that was happening in that first year of your life, which I don't know if I'm totally on board with that, but
yeah.
But there is this idea that like these things earlier can affect you later, and I kind of like that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? Because perhaps not to the extent or the limitation that Freud provided, right? Because like you were saying with eating disorders, Freud would have said, oh, it was, within the first year of your life. But we know that a lot goes into that beyond it. But like you were saying, it is so true that what happens when we're younger absolutely affects us when we're older. Plug for you future physicians. This is why if you decide to go to pediatrics, make sure that you're kind of, making sure a lot. Make sure that you are doing your best to support parents in all aspects of their parenting and not just what you immediately see, because we know that what happens when we're younger affects us when we're older. But just wanted to quickly throw that in there. I'm in a very future physician for our listeners mode today.
Yeah. I mean, that's good because that's what this is all about, like understanding this. Yes, for the MCAT, because the MCAT is going to test these things, but also understanding how this is going to help you be a better physician later on. So the next stage after oral is the anal stage, when this is like 1 to 3 years old. And like the main challenge in this life for like, a 2-year-old is learning to like be potty trained. And so a lot of the focus kind of like lands on that for Freud. But, we talked about how Freud is all over the place and affects a lot of things. I think people don't even realize how Freud has slipped into the regular world. Like you were talking like a Freudian slip. People use that term without actually knowing what it means. But I think the best example of that is calling like somebody saying like, oh, I'm anal retentive, or somebody else is anal retentive. That is literally tied to this anal stage of development.
Yep.
Right. And so according to Freud, like there are people who have these like fixations or problems, and like it's tied to your like bathroom habits when you're trying to develop those. And so you can be anal retentive, which is when you're trying to hold in like your poop, is what he's talking about here in this stage. Like, oh, I have a problem like as a kid who's 2 years old, like I don't like going to the bathroom. I don't like making messes. And so I'm trying to hold on all the time. And so Freud would say that's going to lead to somebody who grows up and who wants control and wants like to have no messes at all and wants like very clean and orderly. And so that's why somebody, if they like keep their house super clean, you might call them anal retentive. Or if they're like trying to control that, is because according to Freud, like that behavior is tied to the anal stage of development. Now, what's interesting is you can also have the flip of that. Like you can have an anal expulsive like fixation, which is going to be the opposite. Someone who like likes to make messes and somebody who lives in a disordered state of life. I definitely know that there are parts of my life that Freud would look at and be like, okay, that something happened when you were 2 because your office is way too messy and your garage is way too messy. And it's just like, okay, it's not that I like making messes, but there's something going on. So anal retentive is like focused on order and cleanliness and control. And anal expulsive is focused more on the other direction is messy and chaos and less of a need for control overall.
I feel like a lot of us have different areas where we are one or the other, right? And so I think that's where it gets interesting because like we say, you know, oh, Freud, fairly outdated, somewhat makes sense for some things. And this being one of them that is, like you said, part of our mainstream conversations and the way that we talk with other people. But there really is, if you think about different parts of your life, there are probably some that you can associate with the different Freudian stages. The reason I say this is because it'll make it easier to remember for testing. So what we're talking about is absolutely testable on the MCAT. And I don't know about you, but for me, it was always ages. Whenever I was studying any of the developmental stages, the ages got me every single time. And that's what I struggled to remember. And so I think what you're doing with, you know, phrasing it around the context of, oh, it's like potty training. What age do you potty train kids really makes a lot of sense. This next stage, I personally thought it was a little tougher to pinpoint a single age.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a product of the times that this was the age he arbitrarily, in my opinion, decided. But basically between 3 to 6 years old. So this is what, like pre-K, daycare, pre-K-ish kind of age, was the phallic stage. So according to Freud, this is all about focusing on genitals and the difference between female sex and male sex. And so Freud said, okay, this is what's happening during this time. And if you kind of get stuck or something goes wrong during this time, you'll have, you know, confusion with your identity. Maybe you're really passive. You might be envious or jealous of the other sex. And so we now know that this is not how we should be thinking about this. But this is also part of why we said, you know, the views that we were discussing were Freud's views.
Yeah.
But this is very much, I think it helps to kind of contain via age and by age. And this would be kind of that pre-K toddler. The reason I think of that is because that's when kids are suddenly playing with a bunch of other kids at once that are not just their family, right? So that can be a way to remember, oh, this is kind of that exploration of the different sexes, right?
Yeah, and like
that
differences between.
Exactly.
Yeah. This is, so I know we've been kind of like talking about this a fair amount, but like there's a lot of doubt now on a lot of Freud's stages with these things, but because he's so influential and a lot of what he's talking about now has shaped so much of the way we talk about and see the world, it's something the MCAT still likes to test. But for example, people who have ADHD tend to be messier, right? And just because like just the way that manifests. And so like Freud would say like all of those people like had issues and things come up between the age of 1 and 3. And like, that's not actually like, there's a biological thing going on here. And so like, that's one of the reasons that we're kind of like, nah, like, I don't know how much we can kind of get behind that. But this phallic stage is also kind of an interesting one. And I think that this is something that, so if you've been around, especially little boys who are like 4 or 5, they'll often just like put their hands in their pants and just like be sitting there and like holding on and like, okay, get your hands out of your pants, Billy. And that's, I think, why Freud kind of landed on this like phallic stage, is because it seemed to be all about it. And according to Freud, and I want to be very clear, this is not my view. According to Freud, like the boys like all were doing that and the girls were all jealous. And so that's where the term penis envy comes from. And this is something that develops in that like 4 or 5 years old, like that pre-K, like 3 to 6. Once again, not sure how much I get behind this, but yeah, so there's some things kind of going on here. This can lead to confused identity and envy of other people. And a lot of these fixations are occurring, according to Freud, due to kind of what's happening in that age of 3 to 6 years old. Now, after that, like it's also kind of weird that like Freud kind of like focuses on that so much. But you start to go into the latent phase, which is what comes after that. And according to Freud, like not that much happens in the latent phase. It's because it's latent and you're just kind of like waiting until like you hit puberty, essentially. But at this stage, you're still working on like social interactions and things like that. But things are not colored by like sexual attraction and things like that. And it's like, according to Freud, and I think this is something most people would kind of agree with, like a 7-year-old probably is not sexually attracted to anything or anyone under normal scenarios. And so it's just like, but like, you know, a 5th grader might have like, oh, this is my girlfriend. And like, they don't really like particularly want a girlfriend, but they just want to kind of pretend to be kind of older and kind of going through this once again, according to Freud. And so these stages, like this is kind of like what's going on here. It's learning about like socialization and interacting with each other. You start to develop like social skills and confidence. And so I think under Freud, like this stage, this latent stage where you haven't quite hit sexual maturity, like you are still working on these like social interactions. So somebody who's really shy, Freud might say there's something maybe going on in this stage, or somebody who is a class clown and needs all the attention all the time, maybe there's something going on in this stage as well. Because this stage is mostly about like just socializing without being colored by that like sexual side of things.
You're making me realize that Freud would probably have an issue with a lot of us introverts.
Yeah.
So I think Freud and I, he'd have a lot of issues with some of us. But yeah, it really is just about that social development, right? And forming those connections. And what I actually want to suggest to our listeners is maybe pause and quiz yourself on some other developmental stages that have to do with connections with other people. Erickson. Oh no. Yeah, I almost made Bill choke. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I was drinking my water in that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
But it's a good way to kind of start connecting things, right? And being able to differentiate, okay, who said what? And under what context would they be appropriate? Because if you think about it, you wouldn't use Erickson stages for combining it with sexual development, right? But you can think of, oh, they both have a time when they're talking about relationships to other people. So how can I kind of use that to help me remember what's what?
Yeah.
So,
and I was going to say, there's something we kind of breezed over in the phallic stage that we should have probably talked about. And that's the Oedipus complex.
Yes.
Which, according to Freud, like at that age, where like people are kind of like focusing on the phallic side of things, like, wow, it's weird. I'll give you that. Freud's views on that stage. That's where penis envy shows up. That's also where generally like boys will fall in love with their mother, in like a romantic sense. And this is occurring like in the phallic stage. Later on, Carl Jung, who is a different psychoanalyst, like added to this and added what he called the Electra complex, which is when a girl falls in love with her dad. And this is kind of like going on here. And so there's also those phrases like Oedipus and Electra complex. Oedipus is named after the character Oedipus, who fell in love and married his own mother. Electra complex, I'm sure, is from some novel or something at some point, but I'm not familiar with. And I kind of don't want to.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah,
I'll resist you. I know a lot of times when we're uncertain about something, we're just like, oh, where did that come from? We'll look it up. And there's some things you just don't want to look up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So that's definitely both the Oedipus and Electra complexes are things you should be associated with that phallic stage as well, before you go into the latent stage, which is when you kind of go into this like almost dormant, like romantic phase as you wait to hit puberty.
Yeah, and I think just remembering that, like we say it's psychosexual development, right? So then it would make sense that the latent phase and the latent stage is the one that does not have any active sexual component to it. Whereas according to Freud, all the other ones, kind of do.
Yeah.
So once you make it, according to Freud, once you make it to puberty, you hit the genital stage. And suspect you know what that means. But basically, people have this sexual desire now that, like you were saying, we don't really anticipate under normal circumstances being the case in middle schooler, right? An early middle schooler or a late elementary student. But now, I was going to say students, now people at this age and once they hit puberty have these kind of sexual urges that they direct towards other people, that they are now interested in. And you could end up in a situation, according to Freud, where now your fixations are you have this transfer from the prior fixations that you've had into a more active sexual form. And so I don't feel like personally, I don't have a whole lot to say on this one because I feel like the first and this one are probably the most self-explanatory.
Yeah. Like going through this and like, once again, Freud kind of connected everything to these stages. And so like, if he's ever talking to any patient or anything, like these are the sorts of things that he's thinking about and trying to understand. And like you said, this is a psychosocial or psychosexual development. So there's a lot of kind of focus on sex, which is a very Freudian thing because it seems like that's what he was thinking about most of the time. But this is like Freud was also a lot older and from a previous era. And so I think that there's a lot of views and things from him that probably wouldn't stand up today. So a lot of things that he would consider sexual, trying to find the word for it, like dysfunctions
Deviance?
Deviance. Yeah, sexual deviance. Thank you. Like basically anybody who's kinky, like Freud would be like, okay, like there's something wrong with you, and it has to do with like something that happened when you were younger. And so homosexuality, like any sort of like role play or kinky things or anything like that, like Freud would immediately be like, this is a pathology related to something that occurred to you when you were younger. And I think that is not necessarily the view now. But like, yes, like according to Freud, like a lot of things like homosexuality are tied to these different stages. Because modern medicine has kind of moved past that. I don't think the MCAT's going to ask you a lot about that, like specifically. But they will ask you to identify different stages. And I think like the oral and anal stage and what's going on with those are much more likely to show up than specifically the genital stage. The phallic stage, you could get something like maybe penis envy or Oedipus complex or Electra complex. Any of those things could kind of show up. But other than that, I don't see them going super deep into the genital stage here because a lot of Freud's views have been kind of debunked at that level. And so, yeah, I don't expect a lot of questions on that.
I wouldn't either. I think there is something else that Freud described that is higher yield, and that would be what happens in our unconscious mind and what happens beyond the surface. So I think something like that, and what we're going to talk about next, is higher yield, and you're more likely to get questions from that compared to the later stages of psychosexual development that we just talked about.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I feel like we're kind of bashing Freud a little bit, and like I think that is healthy, and maybe actually there should be some healthy skepticism there. But he was incredibly influential, right? Before him, no therapists and psychologists were focused on like, maybe you don't understand like how stuff is affecting you and why you're acting these way. Like that's kind of a Freudian thing, which is a huge deal. Yeah. And so he completely revolutionized a lot of this. And the idea that there are things that happen in your subconscious and unconscious mind is a really influential thing. And so while a lot of the details that Freud went into, we've learned to like, I don't know if I'm exactly on board with this. Like the main ideas, like so much of psychology is built upon that foundation. And a lot of that goes to this unconscious mind and your conscious mind, things you're aware of, and also things that you're just not aware of that are happening in your head.
Yeah. And super quick. I mean, we actually hinted at this in the episode with Erikson stages, right? Because Erikson was trained by Freud's daughter was what we had talked about. And so, yeah, Freud had a huge impact on psychology and on how we think about ourselves. And if you think about even now, if someone goes to therapy, they're still analyzing, okay, what's going on beyond the surface, right? What are things that you may not realize about yourself or why you're acting this way? So what you were describing earlier about, as I get older, I realize like, why was I mad? Right. And kind of going beyond the surface. So it's powerful. But like you said, it's just that some of these smaller details don't quite add up. to our current experiences.
Yeah. So another thing Freud talked about is this iceberg model. And this is kind of weird because like Freud had like an image that he like kind of like talked about. And I know that the AMC has actually asked about literally the iceberg model or the iceberg picture. And like, that's strange, right? Like that just kind of like also implies how important Freud is. But with an iceberg, note that a chunk of it is above the water, but a lot of it's below the water.
Yep.
And so Freud liked to kind of like conjure this idea of like things above the water, like that's things we're conscious of, we're aware of, but there's always a lot more underneath that we don't really recognize. And so there is also kind of like a little layer in there where you can like kind of between, which is the pre-conscious. So these are things that these are things we could become aware of. Like you can figure these things out, but they don't jump into your conscious minds immediately. And then there's things that are in the deep unconscious, which are things that like we can never become aware of, like going through here. And so Freud, and so like things like fears and violent urges and motives are things that like there might be some stuff kind of deep in our unconscious that we'll never be able to like perfectly understand. But there are things like certain like repressed memories and feelings, and like diving into those might be in that pre-conscious area, that area that we can learn more about. And then there's your thoughts, your ideas, like what am I seeing, what am I perceiving, and all of those are going to be conscious. And so we have these kind of like different layers here going through. Now, Freud also looks at personality and kind of separates it into like different branches almost. And this is the id, the ego, and the superego. And it's important to understand how this interplays with that iceberg model.
Yeah, I actually really like, this might sound a little weird. I like this part more than the actual iceberg model itself because I think it's more fun to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So the id corresponds to that unconscious aspect of our mind, that deep component of the iceberg, right? Roughly. And so the id is that aspect of ourselves that has all of those desires that may not be socially acceptable, or that just have that base instinct, that base need to fulfill a desire, right? And so I like thinking of cookies. You know, I am huge on sweets.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like thinking about this as that version that just, I will eat the cookie. That is it. I want the cookie. I'm going to act on eating the cookie, and it will be the biggest. Okay, hold on. This is a sidebar. So the hospital that I rotated at for most recently, they have these chocolate chip cookies that they make in-house. They are so good that when my best friend and her husband came and passed through Boston, I got them cookies from the hospital. I was like, eat these cookies.
Yeah.
So that is the id component of my personality. It's just like, oh, I want a cookie. I'm going to have it. I don't care.
Yeah.
Then there's this transitional part of ourselves, and that's the ego. And so in that component, you're trying to balance things out, right? You're saying, okay, how can I balance? I need the cookie with, should I be eating a cookie right now? Where do I straddle the line? How do I do this in a way that it's perhaps more moderated than I may otherwise be if I only listen to the id component of my mind? And so I like to think of that as analogous to the pre-conscious. And again, this isn't like a perfect, oh, you're thinking about it, this is something you have to become aware of. It's something that is still pretty conscious. It's a decision, a conversation that I have with myself fairly frequently, but it roughly maps on to that. I don't know if you want to chat about the superego.
Yeah, the superego. So the superego is a little bit different. I always think of like it's your Jiminy Cricket. It's your conscious, or conscience is the word I'm looking for. I always get confused. Conscience, when I'm talking about Freud, and like it all like floats together. But yeah, so like in Pinocchio, Jiminy Cricket was the one following Pinocchio around. It's like, you should do this, and like that's a bad thing to do, and like telling you what you should and shouldn't do, kind of a voice of morality. And so according to Freud, we have this super ego, right? Or super person kind of in our voice, in our head, saying like, oh, you should do this. You shouldn't do this. Like you shouldn't eat cookies because they're not super good for you. And I think a lot of times people want to look at the superego as like the angel on your shoulder that's like whispering things into your head. And so because of that, they kind of want to look at the id as the devil on your shoulder. But like that's not actually super accurate with the id. The id is like, the id doesn't want to kick puppies, right? Like that's not what the id is doing, or like punch old ladies, right? The id is more like animalistic, right? Like food, right? Like I want to eat the entire cake, or I want to have sex, or things like that. The id is very selfish, right? It's not evil necessarily, but it's very selfish, like what do I want sort of thing. Versus the super ego is focused more on like what's the right thing to do overall. And the ego is kind of the voice of reason. So, and it's important to kind of balance these things, right? Like I always like if I'm at like a retirement party, and I like this analogy, and like the person who's retiring hasn't come in yet, but I'm here with all my coworkers. Like my id says, eat the cake, eat all the cake right now, shove all the cake into your mouth, and then go find Sally, your coworker who you think is pretty, and find a closet and like make out with her for a while. And like that's what my id wants to do, right? My super ego says, instead of cake, you should have some carrots because they're healthier. And then after work, you should not drive home because that's bad for the environment, but you should run home and jog because that's healthier. But you should swing by the homeless shelter and donate all your money on the way. And then do that. 'Cause those are the right moral things to do. And so your id and your ego have these like very different views, right, going through here. And it's your ego's job to balance those. And so your ego is the one saying like, okay, listen, we're going to have some cake, but maybe I'm going to drive home, but maybe I'll go for a walk later. And if I see a homeless person, I'll donate $5 and like give them $5 and that sort of thing. So like balancing these things kind of becomes the job of the ego. And so you want to be really careful, because I think a lot of people want to see the id as like evil, but the id is more just like, think about like a dog, right? Like the things that like, oh, food. Yeah. Or like playing. Yeah. Like your id likes to play. Your id wants to play video games and have sex and eat cake. And like, those are the things that are kind of going on in the id. Not necessarily evil, is just kind of selfish and focused on the self.
Yeah. That's why I really like the example. That's why the cookie example has always stuck with me, because it's not evil, right?
No.
There's just, we know for a couple of different reasons that you can't sit down and eat a whole cake or eat, cookies nonstop, because you're not going to feel well as much as they may taste delicious. Mm-hmm. It's, also not socially acceptable to eat an entire cake by yourself, but also why is that the case? Can we just normalize eating sweets as much as we want? But also it's just not particularly healthy. So Loki, when you were describing your scenario about eating cake and eating carrots and walking home, you described my week because I would negotiate getting the cookie with like this, the rest of my meal, I'm going to have carrots and then I'm going to walk home today. And so that's actually the reasoning that was going on in my head. So I felt a little came for, Phil, just a little.
No, I mean, it's okay. Your ego is very pronounced, and that out of context, that sounds very bad. Yeah. So don't clip that.
Please don't.
But the other thing is like really connecting it to this iceberg thing.
Yeah.
Because obviously the ego, that like rational part of you, is very conscious, right?
Yes.
It's very like you have these thoughts and you're aware of them, right? And your super ego also has like thoughts of like, oh, I shouldn't do that. And that's where a lot of guilt comes from.
Yep.
Is like from the super ego saying, I shouldn't have done that. And so that's what's making you kind of feel that way, is the conscious portion of your super ego. And your ego has a conscious portion, but it also has like that pre-conscious portion as well, where it's like we have some like thoughts and things that we're not perfectly aware of. But all three of them have stuff that's below the surface, right? Like even like the morality side of the ego, right? Like we do have thoughts like, oh, I shouldn't have done this way or acted this way. But there are things that like going into this, there are things that I'm like, I have this view on what is the right thing and wrong thing to do. And then later on, I'm thinking like, why do I think this is right and that's wrong? Like there's not, like, I don't know if that's actually there. And like, I didn't realize it, but there's some stuff in my subconscious that's telling me this is moral and this is immoral. And important to kind of like address that sort of subconscious portion of the superego, the stuff that like maybe I wasn't actually fully aware of.
Yeah.
Your id, on the other hand, is completely in your unconscious mind. I always think about like neuro side of things. I feel like your id is like the animalistic drives. And so that's a lot of your like midbrain, hindbrain stuff that's not in that like forebrain, like super conscious voice. And you don't need to connect this to neuro like this, but I have difficulty not doing it. But like the id is something that animals have. Like a dog has an id, like according to Freud, like different animals have ids, like these urges for sex and reproduction and playing and things like that. According to Freud, animals don't have a superego. Like they're not capable of feeling guilt and shame and things like that. That is definitely not the case for my dog. He can feel guilt. He just doesn't often enough. He will do things. I'm like, I know you know better, Higgs. Come on. But yeah. And so this is like understanding kind of like these different branches, the ego, superego, and id, and understanding how that interplays with the subconscious and conscious mind. So just to reiterate, in the conscious, the ego and the superego are in the conscious, or have some part of them in the conscious. All three of them are in the unconscious mind. And so your ego is not purely conscious. Part of it's underneath the water. So your superego is the same. And your id is entirely below the water. It's that bigger piece. And according to Freud, there's a lot more under the surface than there is above. And just like an iceberg, where most of the iceberg is below the surface.
As always, for concepts that are somewhat fairly, I would say, memorization based, but that maybe you're listening to this and you're like, oh, that actually makes sense. I like, this analogy, or maybe I can come up with my own analogy. I would actually suggest when you have a moment, so if you're listening to us in the car, or if you are, on a treadmill or at the gym, perhaps not right now, don't whip out a pen and paper, but at some point, sit down, draw an iceberg and try to map, okay, what would be conscious? What would be preconscious? What would be unconscious? Where would the ego fall under? What is the ego? What would be an example of the ego versus an example of the superego versus an example of the id? And then, and you laugh, Phil, but I think that would be really helpful because
it would be very helpful. I'm laughing because you said if you're on the treadmill, and I'm like, oh, somebody's superego is very powerful if they're like on the treadmill. I'm like, what if they're at home eating out of a pie tin with not using plates and just like with their hands eating pie?
I will respect that too.
Yeah, that would be pure id. But if you're doing that, wash your hands off later and try to write out things.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I was just laughing at that. I'm like, oh, like you're like, oh, if somebody's on the treadmill and exercising, like, oh, super ego.
The reason I say that is because when I interact with students, sometimes they'll tell me how they listen to our podcast. Mm-hmm. And so things I hear often are driving, while at work, and at the gym, or doing some kind of iteration of exercise, movement, etc. And so that's why that always comes to mind. Maybe it's because that's what I aspire to do. I aspire to get myself to the gym. Whether I actually do or not is a different story. Perhaps my id wins out more than my super ego and things like that.
But I think my ego tires out over time and just gives in to the id. Especially at the end of the day, it's like, all right, fine, let's eat that cake. I know we were trying to be healthy today, but I'm tired. I'm letting the id win. The id is relentless. So if you are watching this podcast on YouTube or in a place where you can put comments, I actually would be kind of curious to hear people's thoughts on id, ego, and superego and examples in their life, because they're always super interesting. And they're super easy to apply this. And I really, like you said, I really like the id, the ego, the superego, the iceberg thing. I think that is way more applicable in today's modern world than Freud's stages of development, which might be why we hadn't talked much about Freud's stages in the past. Is I kind of don't like them. But the MCAT will test them, and understanding it does help you understand more about the world around you, even if it's just understanding what people mean by anal retentive, or somebody says a kind of oral fixation, or if you ever hear about an Oedipus complex, which you might hear mentioned in a hospital or something. And so definitely want to be aware of these things. Insanely influential to the point where I think we're going to talk a little bit more about Freud in a future episode, because there's still Freud's defense mechanisms and things like that. It's really easy to get those twisted around as well. And so Freud is just insanely influential And like it's like one episode is probably not enough to talk about everything that he would be tested on in context of the MCAT.
Yeah, no way. There's just too much of Freud to fit into one episode. But I agree with you, Phil. It'd be really cool if students could let us know if they're on a platform that allows comments, or alternatively, you guys can always email us at podcast@jackwestin.com. Even if you don't get a response, we still see it. And so we have not ignored any of the messages that have come in. We've seen the requests that you guys have made. We're thinking about how to approach topics in a way that is truly useful in a podcast form. But we're always excited to hear from you guys. And thank you for listening to today's episode on Freud.